Here we are, we're up and running. So this is Weekends Web App, a stream where we're going to be coding a web app from start to finish, and we're going to do it all on stream. There's a GitHub repository that you can follow along in the channel description just below. Other than that, I'm pretty much going to get started. This is going to be dry to start off with for anyone who's familiar with web dev. This is why this is day 0, and it will probably be day 0 for a little while we set up all the tooling and sort of get familiar with the basics of a web app. But then we'll be going from there and we'll get into things in earnest, and we'll call that day 1 once we get to that point. Anyway, we have ourselves an empty folder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a README file, and we're going to start off with all the things that we will need to do this web app. So our tools needed to get started. So first thing you will need is you will need a text editor of some description. I use Vim. Most people, I wouldn't recommend using Vim necessarily. It's quite a steep learning curve. It's just the thing that I'm fastest with. So that's why I use it, but you don't have to use it. There are plenty of good alternatives out there. We've got things like Sublime Text, Visual Studio Code. What else we've got? Emacs, if you're on the other side of the fence from Vim. And you've also got the Atom editor. There's a whole range of text editors, and most of them are free. So you're more than welcome to try whichever editor you feel most comfortable with. But you will need a text editor because we'll be doing an awful lot of it. The other thing you'll need is you'll need a terminal. So a terminal is going to be pretty familiar for those of you who already use Linux or Mac systems. But for those of you on Windows, you might have to work a little harder for that. I don't necessarily know the best way to use terminal. I only really use Windows for very niche things personally. But you're more than welcome to go hog wild with whatever terminal you find. All the tools that we're going to be using will work across all 3 platforms using the Node ecosystem, so it should be fine even if you're on Windows to follow along. Next up, what you will need is you will need a web browser. And I've got here 2 web browsers that are perfectly sufficient for what we're doing. We've got Firefox Developer Edition, or just Firefox, they're pretty similar really. And we've got Google Chrome. So you need a web browser. Now those web browsers, the good thing about these 2 particular web browsers, we will need to support other web browsers than just Firefox and Google Chrome. But these are really good web browsers in terms of their tooling, so your ability to essentially run, debug, and inspect your code as you go along. So yeah, Firefox and Google Chrome are good tools for that, and I'll probably swap between them just so we can keep an eye on compatibility things as we do our work, and we'll go from there. All right, so they're the bare bones, but now we need to start getting some particular things so that we can actually do all this work. So I'm going to open an extra terminal window, and we're going to be working through here. So most front-end tooling lives on an ecosystem called Node. So Node is essentially JavaScript that you can run pretty much anywhere, on a server, in the back end, that kind of thing. What we'll be doing is taking the installing Node onto our system and then installing a various bunch of things within the Node ecosystem to help us do all of our work. There are a bunch of different versions of Node, so usually what I'll do is I'll use a Node version manager to handle all this. So we're just going to pick one browser now. We'll change over to just Google Chrome for today. So if you search for Node version manager, you'll find yourself a couple of different scripts, and you can see MVM Windows here is the second reference here. So for anyone who's on Windows, that's probably the one you're going to want to use. But for anyone who's on terminal in our world, you're going to want to go into this one here, creationx/nvm, which is a bash script that allows you to manage various Node versions so that you can keep up with the latest and greatest. In addition, let's have a look at Node.js itself. So Node.js is what allows us to actually run things. So we've got a long-term support edition, and we've got the bleeding edge at 10.3 and the long-term support at 8.11. We may as well just do our work on 10.3. I haven't actually installed that on my system just yet. So you can see here, this is on the NVM page, you can actually see the instructions that let you do this. Now, understand that there is so much to web development that a lot of it is going to be somewhere out there on the web. You need to find the information. There are lots of great resources, and we'll be trying to make a lot of use of all of them as we work through this, because it's important to know that you will not remember everything that we do here. So you need to know where to find that information. So I'll be doing exactly the same thing. This install script is what allows you to install it. So essentially you just copy that into your terminal and run it. I don't know what's going to happen exactly because I've already got it installed. Yeah, it already found out that it was installed and tried to update it. So it's going to go ahead and do that and then give you some instructions to start using NVM. However, I've already got NVM available to me. So if I type NVM, it'll come with a list of instructions. That's not very useful though, so how about I do something a bit smaller, like I do NVM ls, which should give me a list of the versions I have available to me. So you can see that I've been running on 9.8, I haven't actually upgraded to 10. I've got all these old versions because sometimes I work on old projects and I need old versions of Node. But we're going to install the latest version, so let's do just that. So I'm going to go install NVM install 10.3.0, just to be precise. And off we go. That's going to bring that down, it's going to build it and then make it usable to me. It's nice being on fiber, I can tell you that much. Alright, so we're on NVS 10.3 and I'm actually going to make that my default. So alias default 10.3.0. So if we type in NVM alias default, that will make it sort of our default tooling. So we have Node, we have a Node version manager. And I suppose it pays just to chuck in some links as well. Oops. Right. So what do we need next? Well, now we need to talk a little bit about Node itself and the package manager that comes with it. So Node comes with a thing called npm. So I talked about NVM, that's the Node version manager. And then npm is our Node package manager. We're only going to be using that for a little while because I actually want to get onto something that's a little better than npm, which is called yarn. But for the moment we need to use it to install a few tools that we'll need. So the first of them is going to be yarn. So I'm going to npm install global. I'll clear this so I can get rid of all the stuff that's potentially distracting. So npm install, we're going to want to install it globally so that I can use it no matter which project I'm in. I'm going to install yarn. And yarn is another thing that allows me to essentially build out bits and pieces for our project. Actually, I'll delete those just for now. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Okay, there are other general tools that I'm going to need. So I need to install gulp. There is a lot of opinion on how you can build a web project and make it into something you can use. I'm going to be trying to sort of build my way up from essentially little scripts that can work our way to what we need. But before I talk about that, maybe it's better if I go back for just a moment and talk about the basics that we need for a web application. Alright, I'll just put these bits and pieces here. And what else do we need? We need yarn. Alright. And actually, you can use either of those things, right? So, now we're onto those tools. Now let's talk just briefly about what is it that actually makes a web app, because we're going to need to write some code and that's going to need to turn into a web application. And no matter what abstractions you use, whatever coding you end up sort of working with, at the very high level, you're always going to end up with three primary things coming out of that code, which turns into your web page. And we can boil that down if we jump on over here. This is the blackboard. Let's see how we go. Right, so we've got a document. And that document is made up of HTML. I might change the color here. So that document has a structure to it. And I might as well take a moment just to show you what that structure is. If we go over to, say, any web page, even this one here that's Node.js. If we have a look over here, all of this element here, these items are all parts of the essentially the document, the HTML that makes up this document. And in fact, what it would be better is if I go and look at the page source itself. So you can see here we start off with a doc type. We work our way through this syntax that turns into a web page. And if you start to read it, you start to notice essentially where parts of the document came from. So if we go into the head, you can see in here we've got the title Node.js, and that's what actually appears up here in the page title. We'll go through, we'll eventually learn what all of this stuff means, but if we move down past the head into the body, then we start to see more structure that we saw in the navigation. So you can see here, home, about, downloads. We can see all of that stuff up along the top here. And for those of you who plan along with home, it's really quite easy to look at a page's source. You can right click pretty much anywhere where there's not an item that you're working with, and you can see the view page source option here, and that will allow you to look at what's underneath. And even better, say you right clicked on a particular part of the web page, you could click inspect, and you could see in this inspector here, you could see where that is. And in fact, I could edit this and end up changing that, just like that. So these are very malleable documents as they stand. But anyway, getting back to the technology. So this lies out the structure of the document. You can see P tags, they're short for paragraph, so you can see that's where the text is. These anchor tags, anchor tags are where we'd make links. So this here would be turned into this link just here that I'm hovering over right now. All that put together, you end up working all your way down through the rest of the document. Now, in addition to things that just belie the structure of the document, it also has tags that reach out to resources. And one of those resources are CSS. So we'll see if there's any CSS tags up in the head here. Yeah, here we go. So you can see here we've got some links to some style sheets just here. So the first one is their general styles, and the second one here is a link out to a web font from Google. So that way they can start to bring their own custom fonts to a web page rather than just relying on the fonts that are installed on the app on the operating system itself. So this CSS, the way this works is this is CSS that will load before it actually starts showing anything, and this CSS will load up, and we can have a look at that file as well. It's one that's been condensed down a bit, so they've removed all of the white space in that one, so it might be hard to read it. So what I might do instead, so if we were to look at, say, this button right here, and I'm going to inspect that, and then I'm going to draw your attention over to the right hand side here, where it shows a bunch of rules. And these rules essentially talk about how this element, this item, is supposed to look. There are lots of different ways in which these target particular parts of the page. They're called selectors. So this here is a selector, and this button here will have a class on it. You can see that class, let me just highlight it just there, home download button. That class there allows the CSS to target it, and that CSS tells it what to look like. So we could do something really straightforward here. We could play with the color and actually change the color, which you can see on the left hand side. I mean, that's maybe a little subtle for the stream, so how about we change the hue entirely down to blue. So you can see there, I'm playing with that color at random. I could also turn off certain things and it would change it, but maybe I want to change the padding or change the margin. Let's say we want to give this rounded corners. One time long ago, this was a big deal to be able to do this, but now it's very simple. So I can, throw some rounded corners on that. Oh no, there's something that's overriding it just here. So let me change it here. Let's give it a big old round corner there, 50 pixels. So there's a lot of things that you can do with CSS, and while a lot of developers do rail against CSS as a tool, it's extremely useful. You can do a lot with it nowadays, especially with things like Flexbox, which has made it a lot easier to do fairly straightforward things like centering and layout. That's always the joke. How do you vertically center something? And it turns out there's like 3, 4, 5, 6 ways these days, and people kind of don't like that. But CSS is very flexible and can be used to make your web page or web application look however you want it to do. And so that CSS will load on top of that HTML. So if we go back to this structure here, and let's pick a color. How about green will do? There we go. All right, so there will be reference points in the document which call out to our CSS. And these, sorry about this, but I'm very shaky with it. I've only just started with the tablet. So anyway, that CSS will get laid over the top of your HTML. And I mean, you can pull these resources out and put them back in again once you start playing a bit more with the website. We can change out what style sheets are in there while people are looking at the site. But generally what happens is the HTML loads, it grabs the CSS, and it doesn't show anything until it's also got the CSS, depending on how high you put the CSS. So if you put the CSS right at the top, it's going to load that CSS before it shows anything in the document. That's called render blocking, and it's a very important thing to understand once we start to try and get performance, but we're not going to worry about it too much yet. Now, once you've got the HTML and the CSS, the web page is technically usable. Okay, there's lots of things you can do with the web page. You can look at it, you can click on links, you can potentially use form elements. So form elements would be things like buttons and selects and text areas and that kind of thing. But anything beyond those sort of hard-coded behaviors, you're not going to get. So it's important at a certain point, if you want to make your app work a lot of clever ways, a lot of like either just additional layers of polish on the basic user experience, or something like a full-blown web application, you need some sort of scripting language or programming language. And the language of choice that always ends up on your web browsers is JavaScript. So that JavaScript in this page, I don't know how much JavaScript actually runs on the Node.js website, but we can take a look at the page source again and see what JavaScript gets called. So if we look in the head, there is nothing in the way of JavaScript that gets called. But if we look at the bottom, we should be able to find some JavaScript. So let's see. Most of it has been added inline, except for this one here. And this one here at the bottom, this download.js. So these scripts are ways to tell the website to do something when you do something. That's a really vague way of putting it, I understand that. And it's because the role of JavaScript in the web page has grown and grown and grown to the size of a great big balloon. So at this point, you can do almost anything with the right access credentials and the right permissions with your JavaScript. You can do almost anything. And when I say anything, it almost gets to the point of intercepting web requests and sending different things back. That's something that's recently been added, a concept called service workers. There are so many things that you can do with JavaScript now that you couldn't do when it was first brought in, which was just as a little ways to improve web pages. But let's look at some little ways that this web page has been improved by using JavaScript. So if we look here, we've got this little function. If we try to read it, we can see it finds some element that they've decided to call scroll to top. And I reckon if I went through into the web page, I should be able to find that item wherever it is. So let's have a look around for it. Now they've hidden it, dastardly. Okay, here we go. So if we have a look down here, we can see a little button that has the, let me change off display now. So if we look down the bottom right, we'll see a little button called scroll to top. And at the moment that doesn't show because we can see the whole page. But if we do something like this and scroll down, I reckon eventually we'll see it. There we go. Okay, so you can see a little button here, scroll to top. And what they've done is made it so that that hides and shows based on where you are and then scrolls you up through the screen. So if we look at that code, we can see here it's got a little function that listens to window on scroll. We'll get into the details of this later, but I'll just like in the brass tacks of what it is about. It takes, puts a little handler here and has a look and sees if the if the page has been scrolled down at all, it will make it visible. Otherwise, it will make it hidden. That's pretty much all it does. And then it's got a little click handler, and that click handler allows you to click on it, and then it will reset your scroll back up to the top. That's all it does. And at the heart of it, like, web apps is all about manipulating the browser to do certain things within the constraints of this model. So you're looking at HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all working together. So if we jump on back here, so we finally got, oopsie daisy, there we go. All right, and then finally, usually at the foot, we'll be loading some JavaScript. The reason we put it at the foot is usually so that the whole page can load before the JavaScript is requested, so that way it doesn't block in any way anything that you would require, like anything to put something in front of the user. Because often, especially with larger web apps, this JavaScript payload can be extremely large, and it's important to get it to the user as quickly as possible. So these are JavaScript files. And that loads in, and those JavaScript files will run and allow you to do things which change the structure of the HTML and the CSS. And this is important because that HTML and CSS we saw, any web app is essentially made up out of that. All the JavaScript is doing is changing its shape based on events that happen, things that happen throughout the time that you're interacting with things. And now I did miss one important resource. I will talk about it more later. But I want you to know that I did not know that also know that the web is made out of cat GIFs as well. Okay? So we will have plenty of cat GIFs eventually on our web page. But that'll take some time before we get there. Let's get rid of that. That's embarrassing. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the basics. So we need a web page with some HTML. So how do we do that? Well, we could just write some. Yeah, let's just write some to start off with. Let's make it real simple. Before we even worry about any tooling or anything like that, we're just going to write some basic HTML. So I'm going to make a directory. This is going to be our app, our front-end app. Let's call it client. And we're going to jump in there, and we are going to make ourselves an index.html. I always forget. I don't write doc types very often. So I'm like, oh, what is a doc type? And the doc type is going to be... This used to be a lot more complicated, but these days you just write a doctype.html, and that's just to let people know what standard of HTML you're working from. And these days, yeah, as I said, it's a lot simpler. So we're going to put some basics here, and then we're going to have a look at it in a web browser. So let's see, we need a title, so we'll call it the Weekends Web App. We're going to have a body. We're going to close that body. So the HTML syntax, if you haven't already seen it, is essentially you've got tags that have angle brackets on either side, and then closing angle brackets on the other side. So that way you can work through your structure and you can sort of see where is the beginning and where is the end. Oh my lord, I've forgotten a HTML. Let's put that in. And we're going to declare it as language of English, and we'll do more interesting things with the locale eventually. Right, at the end we'll close off the HTML. Technically that's all we need, but let's put in some text content as well. So let's go Weekends Web App as the title. And because of course this is a hello world, let's put in hello world. Great. All right. So we have ourselves a basic web page. Now, give me one moment. Let me drag this over. So all I want to do is I want to put this somewhere where we can read it. There we go. Okay. So this is our file. You can see pretty much I've just served it straight from my file. Most web browsers don't let you do an awful lot when you load a web page in this way, and it's simply for security reasons, so they can't do nasty things like getting into your files and whatnot. So there's not a huge amount that we'll be allowed to do from this web app. So eventually we'll be serving it from some like a little server, but for now this is what it looks like. And we can change this pretty easily. So I'll just go hello world with extra exclamation marks because we're extremely excited. And we've got those extra exclamation marks. So what else do we need? Well, we need some CSS. So let's make a bit of CSS. So what about we go app.css. So with that app, what we're going to do is we're going to, let's say we'll change the background color. And we'll make that just a slightly lighter, not full, we'll make it a shade of gray. Okay, so just to explain this is the selector. So we're making the body. We're making the body of the document, and we're giving it a background color of this hex color. Okay, so hex colors have variables that range from 0 through to 9, and then from A to F. F being the absolute highest. This is a hexadecimal code for color. So we're going to make that not quite white. We're going to make it a little off-white. A couple of steps down. That'll be 32 steps down from white out of 256. Never mind. We'll get into it sooner or later. So if we do that, that's not going to do anything just yet because we need to also reference this. So if we go back to the page source of this one here, we can see ourselves some links in the head. And these links determine things like style sheets as well. So that is pretty much the rule that we're going to take our way over onto here. Now, I don't know what file permission, like I don't usually develop straight from files like this, so we'll see how this behaves. But my hope is that if I aim at app.css with this, I will end up being able to see it in this file. So let's see. Okay, so here we go. We've got some color here. Now let's say we want to take the H1 and we want to say make it a sans serif font. So we don't want Times New Roman. We want something, or whatever that font is right now. It's probably not Times New Roman. We want to give it a sans serif font. So if we do that, you can see here, we're now onto the sans serif font that my operating system just sort of chose as a default. We can also be specific. We can choose specific fonts, but they have to belong on the operating system or be provided through some sort of web font service, which we'll eventually get to that. So that gives us some CSS. And now let's say we want some JavaScript. So we can write some JavaScript too. So let's do that. We'll do an app.js. Yeah, what do we do with this app.js? Well, let's just start off with a console log. Hello world. And this is gonna, you're gonna use this to debug in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. Console log is a very useful tool to show what is happening over time with your app. Now, it's not running yet. So we need to, just like before, we need to reference this script so that we can run it. And we can see an example of this down at the bottom of this page here. So let's throw that into our footer. So we throw it just before the end of the body, so that way everything loads before we get to it. So that's called app.js. Now again, I'm not sure what the permissions look like when you just serve a HTML file like this, but it should be fine. Okay, so there you can go. You can see our hello world. That might be a little small. There we go. Let's zoom that in. So yeah, you can see this hello world, and we're off to the races. We have some JavaScript. Now, it's not very exciting. So what could we do in addition to that? Well, let's say we had a timer. So let's create a time element. It's not technically how you're meant to use time elements, but anyway, it's going to be a counter, and it's going to start at 0. Okie dokie. So that time element, just there, it's not doing anything. What if we made it tick up every 1,000 milliseconds? And I'm going to do this in a very naive way, but let's just make it tick up every 1,000 milliseconds. Because this is loading at the bottom, we probably won't have to wait until the whole document is ready or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a function. That's how you make a function in JavaScript, in regular plain old JavaScript. And we're going to call it, oh, actually it's not, because we've got to give it a name. Geez. All right, let's give it a name of tick1. All right, so we've got this function, and God knows JavaScript is one of those languages that's seen a lot of changes as well, so sometimes the way you write a function actually changes an awful lot. But anyway, this function is going to get this item, this time element, and then what it's going to do is increment it by 1. So what we may as well do, we're going to store a variable, which is going to be our counter, just so that we don't have to keep track of it by reading it. And what we're going to do is we're going to get that time element. So let's go var time element. So this HTML turns into what's called the document object model. And it means all of these little pieces of our document are actually accessible if we write our JavaScript the right way. So if we went document.query selector time, that would give us this time element. So just to demonstrate that, we're going to do this, and I'm going to just jump ahead just a little bit, and I'm going to call this just a little bit after. In fact, no, it's already going to be loaded by the time it gets to here, so we can pretty much just call tick1 straight away. So this is how we call a function right here, tick1. And you know what? We're going to do it this way, just so you know. Some people say you need the semicolons, but you don't need the semicolons. Anyway, so if we do that, you can see here we've got this element in that second console log, the time element. And if I click on reveal on elements panel, it is exactly that one right there. And there's all sorts of things we could do. We could remove it, we could move it around, we could change its shape, we could change its CSS that it applies to it. But all we're going to change in this time is we're going to just change that ticker. So what we'll do is we'll tick it up 1. So we will go counter plus plus. That's going to increment this number up. And then we're going to take the time element and take its inner text. Actually, text content, my bad. Text content, and we're going to make that equal counter. And that's pretty much it. And let's have a look at what happens here. So you've got the number 1 here. And let's see if that function, yes, that function is available to me. Let's call it again. Let's call it again, and again, and again. Now, normally you wouldn't make your JavaScript code available like this. It's kind of dangerous, so most code is actually developed in what's called a closure. And what that means is say if we did all of this inside this kind of construct, where the function looks like this. Just got to put this in here. All right, off we go. So this will still run exactly as we just did. So you can see here, it ran that first tick count and raised the number. But now I cannot access, oh, what's that? No, I can't. Yep. So I was just remembering what I did last time. I can't actually reach tick 1 anymore because it's hidden inside that closure. But we will get more into that eventually. The idea here is you want to make your code safe eventually. We don't quite have the global namespace thing going for us anymore. So anyway, that's ticking up once, and that's only so useful for us. So what else could we do? Well, we want this thing to happen every little while. We want it to happen every 1 second or every 1,000 milliseconds. And 1,000 milliseconds, there's a function that allows you to do something after that delay, but obviously because of well, not obviously necessarily, but because there is a delay while things happen in your code, it won't always be exactly on time. So it is not something you can certainly bet on when it comes to exactly timing things out. But anyway, for our purposes now, it will be just fine. So we want it to tick 1 every little while. So what we're going to do is we're going to set it to do that after a timeout. And this is part of a large set of things that are available to us on the window item, or like the window object is sort of the root object that gives us a whole range of functions, and pretty much everything attaches to it if you don't attach it anywhere else. But set timeout is one of these functions that is always available to us. It's available on every browser, and what that allows us to do is say, I want you to run this function, so tick 1, I want you to run tick 1 in 1,000 milliseconds. So we will now see a delay when we run this. You can see there, off it goes. So we want this to run again. So what we can do to do that is we can actually call the set timeout inside the tick 1 function. And we are off to the races. So now you can see, oops, sorry, I dragged my mouse off. You can see that we have our timer kicking away there. And we have some JavaScript running. And this is pretty much all you need to write a web app. However, unfortunately, this tooling doesn't get us very far. So we wouldn't want to have to write everything like this, because if we did, we would essentially run into a lot of problems in terms of how we manage dependencies, what code is relying on what code, how do we make it all work together in a seamless way, how do we test everything. There's just going to be a lot of problems if we just write code this way. And this is honestly why front-end tooling is a lot more complex than it used to be. It used to be that you only wrote a little bit, like your HTML was rendered by the back end, and it would send things off, but the thing that you actually got on the front end was still just some HTML, some CSS, and maybe a little JavaScript just to make things a little bit nicer, just like the Node.js page has, just a little bit of JavaScript. But these days, you've got a lot more JavaScript running on that front end. You've got front ends that are either bigger in terms of the amount of lines of code that represent them. They are bigger than the back end. So it's important for us to start to have some tools which actually allow us to work with everything. And that's what we're going to start to put together. We're probably not going to get too far through it. I'm basically putting these streams together like 1 hour, and then we'll stop, and then we'll pick up again tomorrow. And we'll do as many of these day zero pieces as we need to get to the point where we actually do start laying down code for the actual end result. But these day zero streams will be focused around bringing anyone up to speed who's completely new to web development, and then going from there. We will be seeing a lot of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS as we go on through this project. So I'm not going to go through the entire spec or fully explain them in lots of fastidious detail. We will get a lot more detail as we go on. What we're going to do now is we're going to go into some degree of tooling. But what we might do as well as that, we might actually commit the work that we've just done. And the reason for that is because it's nice to have something that represents what we've got as a naive representation of what a front page could be. So day 0a basic HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. All right, and we'll push that up. So for anyone who wants to follow along, all of this is available at github.com/weareoffsider/weekendswebapp. So if you have a look on here, I'm not actually logged in or anything like that, but you can start to see all of the things that we're starting to put in here. Anyway, back to things. So now we're back to what exactly it is that we need for this web app. So if I jump back into our README, we're going to need tools to make high quality HTML, high quality CSS, and high quality JavaScript. The one good thing about the HTML side of things is we don't actually need to write an awful lot of HTML. And the reason for that is most of that HTML will actually be created by our JavaScript. Once you have a fully fledged front-end web application, the HTML bit gets built by your JavaScript. So you end up with fairly straightforward app shells, as they were, which allow the JavaScript to do whatever they need to do and just set it up looking like a loading screen to start off with, and then it rolls on from there. So we need something for HTML, something simple, nothing too complicated, just a simple templating thing for HTML. We need something for JavaScript, and we need something for, oh gosh, my thing is betraying me at the moment. Right, so we need something for our CSS. And we're also going to pick something to sort of work from. So these might be languages that are slightly different to HTML, JavaScript, or CSS, but it's mainly because we need to write a lot of it, so we need something better than what the raw tools provide us. So when it comes to these tools, what we're going to do is we're going to choose a little templating layer called Pug for HTML, and that's just so we can write a lot of it without all of the braces back and forth. Yep, those are pugs. That's not what I actually intended to do. What I intended to find was Pug templating. So this Pug templating lets us look at essentially making a fairly simple HTML. Let me find a good example of what I'm talking about. Here we can see it gives us ways to output paragraphs in certain ways, output pretty much anything that we want in various ways. It makes it fairly easy for us to also include certain elements. You can see here we've got different files. It allows us to include them in so that we can get them repeated in various ways. And this index syntax, I kind of like it because it makes it a lot easier to read the document. When you look at HTML, it's quite unsightly to read. It can be hard to separate the wheat from the chaff, so it's kind of nice to have something that's a little more terse. So we'll be using Pug for any HTML that we write. I will constantly call it Jade, mainly because it used to be called Jade, and it still has that space on NPM, but Pug, I'm referring to the same thing. Now, instead of writing JavaScript, we're going to be writing TypeScript. TypeScript is JavaScript, it's a superset of it, and the main thing it adds to JavaScript is it adds what are called types. One of the things that makes JavaScript notoriously hard to write in a large-scale environment is it's an extremely permissive language. It lets you pretty much do anything. It lets you play with the fabric of what you're working with. And because of that, it can sometimes make it hard to work with because you can do a lot of dangerous things with it, but also because it doesn't tell you when you've made mistakes, really at all. And because of that, it's kind of nice to have something that just sort of prevents you from making those mistakes. And TypeScript is good for that. It uses a fairly modern syntax, you can see here. And it's a fairly modern and agreed upon syntax, unlike using like a whole range of tools out there that turn future JavaScript into current JavaScript that actually works in browsers. And one of the downfalls of that can be you don't actually know which project, like which version your project is actually targeting of which version a target is actually a version of JavaScript a project is targeting. So it can mean that the syntax that works one place doesn't work in another. So TypeScript gives us a happy medium. It's a well-maintained language, well-maintained, and by Microsoft. I mean, you know, Microsoft get a bad rap, especially with the whole purchasing GitHub thing and all that, but they are, you know, they're pretty legit these days, and they really have done a lot of good things for the JavaScript ecosystem with their work on TypeScript. I mean, it was shaky at first, but it's now really, really good to work with. It's version 2.9 right now. Anyway, enough of singing the praises of the language. The main thing that it gives us is it will give us a lot of warnings if we make mistakes, and I'm bound to make those mistakes because, honestly, this is live. That's how mistakes happen. And it's just good whenever we need to change a lot of things all at once. It'll let us know what we've missed, because normal JavaScript wouldn't let you know that, and it can mean that bugs and mistakes can slip into your code and get unnoticed for a very long time. One moment. Right. So what we're going to be doing now is, going through with this JavaScript. This TypeScript will give us a lot of opportunity to use things sort of the way we want to, and there's a lot of things that we can do with it. And TypeScript will just make it a lot easier for us to write good, clean code that won't have as many errors in it. It will definitely have errors in it because all code has errors in it at some point, but we'll make less of them. And the last thing, for CSS, we will be using less CSS. Not actually using less CSS, but the library called less, which is CSS with just a little bit more, which will probably bend your brain just a little bit more. What less allows us to do is use things that just aren't in CSS. Stuff like variables, mix-ins, which are ways to mix various rules together. It has a range of functions so we can work with colors and reuse colors in particular ways. And just a whole lot of other features that you can find very useful. There are a bunch of other CSS tools out there. I'm not going to hash the debate between stylus and Sass and all the different syntaxes. These days, I've settled on less. It's pretty close to CSS in a lot of ways, so it's not that far from what you'd expect in a CSS environment, and I like it. It's been a fairly predictable library to work on top of for quite a while. So that's the one I'm going to be working on. But these tools all boil down to your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And I think the important thing to understand about all of this is when you do web dev, you're not abstracted far enough away that you can actually get away with not understanding HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Even if you're writing Elm, which tries to abstract you entirely from the JavaScript, you will not get away from JavaScript. So if you want to be a front-end web developer, unfortunately, you have to learn these things. And it pays to know them well, because there are so many times when a library you are provided, some sort of tool you are provided, will not get you the whole way there. So it's important to have these things. So we only got 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start off just getting some tools for HTML and CSS. We'll leave the JavaScript tooling for another day, because honestly, JavaScript tooling is a whole debate in itself. It takes a long time, and it's why honestly I dread starting projects sometimes. So let's leave that for now, and instead we're going to go into the realm of HTML and CSS just for a little bit. So the first dependency that we're going to run npm init, which is a way to get our package started up. Okay, so the package name is going to be Weekends Web App. That's fine. We've got a version, description, entry point. I'm going to just pass through all of these. I don't really care too much about all of them. Yeah, we'll do this one. I'm the author. That works for me. And we're going to be doing this under an MIT license. Right, this is okay. So now we have an package.json file. That's this guy just here. And this package.json file tells npm, which is the node package manager, if you remember. The node package manager is what allows you to install different packages. But you've also got a package manager called Yarn, which is quite useful, and you can use pretty much either of them. So if we wanted to install Pug, we would type in, let's clear this. My microphone is actually down there, so it gets in my way. All right, so if we go npm install save, nope. All right, npm install save dev Pug, that will install Pug for us. And it will do its thing, kick along. Hopefully shouldn't take too long. All right, off it goes. It's got Pug. Now, Pug will be stashed in our node modules file, along with everything else it's dependent on. So even just like the few things that we've brought into our space has come with it an awful lot of baggage. And this is just the way Node works. Lots of dependencies, they all get pulled in, deal with it. We don't, when we're running Git, which is our version control system, we don't actually want those that node modules file to come in to, we don't want it to actually be committed. So I'm going to add a git ignore. And we're going to put node modules in that. So now, oopsie daisy. So now if I run git status, you'll see that it's not actually paying attention to that node modules file. Right. Now, what we also want is we want something for less CSS. So if I back up over to here, yeah, it's less. And if it's a dev dependency, this is what that same command, that npm install command, looks like for Yarn. All right, we done. So now what we should see is in our package dot, I thought that would complete, package.json. There we go. All right. So now we'll see some dev dependencies, like which is short for development dependencies. See that in lesson Pug. And these have certain versions. Now, while semantic versioning is a good idea in theory, unfortunately it's not very nice to us. So we're going to be doing that, which is essentially fixing those versions in place, and we'll just upgrade them as we need to. Now that we've installed those, what we'll also find is in our node modules file, if I show the hidden files rather, we'll see various things that we can run, like a less compiler. And where's the Pug compiler? Oh, does it not give us a Pug compiler? That's a surprise. I thought it gave us one of them. It looks like it doesn't come with a CLI. Well, let's find out what's going on there. Maybe if we go npm, and we'll just see if there is a Pug CLI that's separate. Pug CLI, there we go. So that's the one we want. So we actually want the Pug CLI as well. So if you've been paying attention, we can do that with yarn add the Pug CLI. Now the thing about that is I don't get access to all of those commands directly because they're not on my path. I'm not going to talk about pathing too much, but essentially the path, echo path. Oh, that's not right. I want that. So echoing path gives you a place where your device, your computer will try to find all of the different places where commands can be run. Now, they're not accessible directly to us because it's not on the path. We're not going to worry about the path because I'm really not going to be using these executables that often directly like this. But if I just clear this, we are going to run, say, node modules .bin/pug. And at the moment, it's not going to do anything really because it's got nothing to latch onto. So I haven't told it to do anything, like say, get an index.pug. Can't find it. doesn't know where it is. And this one doesn't, this CLI does not fail particularly gracefully, unfortunately. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to, that's my editor screen. So let's open that up. And instead, what we're going to do is for our source file, sorry, our client folder, what we're going to do is instead of having an index.html in there, we're going to have ourselves an index.pug. So let's go client index.pug. And this index.pug is going to look an awful lot like the index.html. So let's get stuck into it. So let me just remind myself how to do the doc types with them. Just doc type HTML. All right. So now we get into things. So we'll have a head, we'll have a title. Daisy. All right. So we have a link, and that link will go get our style sheet. We don't need the closing tags. Get rid of the body. Have a H1. We have a paragraph tag. Have a time tag. All right. And we have a script tag. And that should now be everything that we need. So if we jump over to this terminal here, and I'm going to back up one, go to node modules, .bin, and run our pug CLI, and we're going to run it on index.pug. And it rendered an index.html. So now if we open that there, should look pretty much the same. What if we change the pug file a little bit? This is rendered from the pug template. Oh my god, how bad is this typing right now? All right, it's a bit cold, that's what I blame it on. All right, so now if we run that once more time, so we can see that pug template, and that's rendered out. Now we should have just enough time to do our CSS as well, so let's do that. So now we're going to make a quick departure from this and edit client app.less. So if we take a look at our CSS, app.css, now the good thing about less is it's a superset of CSS. So valid CSS generally is valid less. So if we do something like this, app.less, oh yeah, and let's make that app.css. Okay, so now we have the CSS. I mean, that technically works, but let's put in something that is less in it. So let's go color gray, and let's make it a bang on color gray, like a lot closer to the middle, like 888, and then we'll use that color gray here. So this is an example of variables, which I mean technically you can do in CSS, but not this way. And CSS, like you can do a lot more with variables in a pre-processed language like this. So now we've got a CSS, and you can see that that CSS has definitely changed on this side here. All right, well, that pretty much brings us to the end of that stream. That's been 1 hour. So what we've done is we've made ourselves a little bit of HTML and CSS. We have not actually built ourselves a full line of tooling that's going to allow us to launch in development of any app anytime soon. But we will get this probably in a couple of hours, depending on how we work through things. And then we'll launch into the app proper. But that pretty much wraps up the stream for here. So what we're going to do is commit this. So we've got all sorts of things here. I'm going to pretty much add the lot with reckless abandon. So day 0A. With CLI. Right. And that's pretty much it. So that is out up on, as was said before, it's on the, oh no, I haven't got it there anymore. So let's jump on back over there to GitHub. We are Offsider Weekends Web App. So you can see that code's all there. I'll eventually explain all these bits and pieces here. But for the moment, we're going to be working through our tools. The next time we come around, what we're going to do is essentially launch into some degree of tooling that allows us to do this automatically every time. So we're not doing it by hand using the command line here. There's not a lot of viewers there, but if there's anyone who has any questions, now's the time to ask them. And then after that, I will sign off. Oh no, I think my chat or something has crashed. Let's double check that. Oh, nothing in there. All right, so that's pretty much it for today. I will be back tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time for day 0B of Weekends at Web App. Thanks for watching.